Hey everybody, Marcus here. We all have conversations with people, well, regularly. So if someone were to suggest that we need to learn how to dialogue, the thought would seem absurd, if not insulting. But if we look at how we tend to converse with others, we find a few patterns emerge. It is more so than not the case that a speaker will tend to make a series of assertions which the interlocutor accepts without question, well, if he is a friend. We listen to the gist of the meaning of what is being said, and while it is still being said, we are already formulating a response in our minds, only devoting a fraction of our attention to what we now deem as superfluous information. If the interlocutor happens to be someone who holds a contrary point of view, we listen even less and focus on toppling our interlocutor's position by finding fault in any detail of what they say. If we look upon this model of conversation, what do we find absent? We find that there is no dialogue. In the first case, the case where the interlocutor is a friend, we find that our conversation is little more than the exchange of speeches loosely organized around some topic. First, one speaker gives their confession as to the matter of things. Then, the next speaker gives their confession, agreeing in full or elaborating in places. Then, we return to hear another speech from the first speaker again. Now, this cycle goes on and on until the two part ways. In the second case, the case where the interlocutor holds a contrary opinion, we find that once again we see confessions given in the form of speeches. The variation here is that both attempt to court logic in undermining the position of their interlocutor. When one party feels they have sufficiently defeated the argument of their opponent, they fallaciously conclude that because their position is in opposition to their opponent, and their opponent has been proven to be wrong, then it follows that they themselves are right. It never enters the mind of either interlocutor that it is also possible that they are both wrong. So, what we find is the following. In the first case, both interlocutors enter the conversation with the belief they possess knowledge on a subject. As both agree on the subject, they simply agree with each other in elaborate ways and do not feel the need to question the truth values of the propositions they put forward. In the second case, both interlocutors enter the conversation with the belief they have knowledge on the subject. As they disagree, they focus on convincing the other of the fault in their position in anticipation of replacing the beliefs of their opponent with their own. In neither the first or the second case do we see an example of a dialogue. But if this is the case, then what would a dialogue actually look like? Well, let me read to you sections 109d to 113d of the Platonic dialogue entitled Alcibiades. This segment is very revealing as it not only demonstrates how a dialogue ought to look like, but the details of how a dialogue works is part of the subject matter of the dialogue. Now, before I read out this section, let me give some context. Alcibiades is a 20-year-old ambitious Athenian. Alcibiades is very tall, very handsome, very rich. He comes from a noble family. He has bested all his peers in all athletic competitions, and now he wants to become a politician. Earlier in the dialogue, we discovered that the ambitions of Alcibiades verge on megalomania. First, he wants to become the most influential man in Athens, followed by becoming the most influential man in Greece, then Europe, and finally the world. Socrates meets up with Alcibiades a few days before Alcibiades intends to present himself to the public and the polis as a political figure. Socrates begins to ask Alcibiades about, what a politician does, and they finally get to the subject of justice. Alcibiades is convinced that he understands justice, but Socrates has his doubts. This is the point from which I will start reading the dialogue. But how could it, my dear Alcibiades? Don't you realize that this is something you don't understand? Or perhaps, when I wasn't looking, you've been seeing some teacher who taught you how to tell the difference between the more just and the less just. Have you? Well, who is he? Tell me who he is so that you can sign me up with him as well. Stop teasing me, Socrates. I'm not. I'll swear my friendship, yours and mine. I'd never perjure myself by him. So tell me, who is he, if you can? And what if I can't? Don't you think I might know about justice and injustice some other way? Well, yes, you might, if you found it out. Well, don't you think I might find it out? Well, yes, of course, if you investigate the matter. And don't you think I might investigate it? Well, yes, I do, if you thought you didn't know. And didn't I once think that? Ah, a fine answer. Can you tell me when this was, when you didn't think you knew about justice and injustice? Well, was it last year that you were looking into it and didn't think you knew? Or did you think you knew? Answer me truthfully, or else our conversation will be a waste of time. Yes, I thought I knew. Didn't you think the same thing 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, and four? I did. But surely before you were a boy, weren't you? Well, yes. Well, now, at that point, I'm sure you thought you knew. How can you be sure of that? When you were a boy, I often observed you, at school and other places, and sometimes when you were playing knucklebones or some other game, you'd say to one or another of your playmates very loudly and confidently, not at all like someone who was at a loss about justice and injustice, that he was a lousy cheater and wasn't playing fairly. Isn't that true? But what was I to do, Socrates, when somebody cheated me like that? Do you mean what should you have done if you didn't actually know then whether or not you were being cheated? But I did know, by Zeus. I saw clearly that they were cheating me. So it seems that even as a child you thought you understood justice and injustice. Well, yes, I did understand. At what point did you find it out? Surely it wasn't when you thought you knew. Well, of course not. Then when did you think you didn't know? Think about it. You won't find any such time. By Zeus, Socrates. Well, I really can't say. So it isn't by finding it out that you knew it. Well, I guess that's not very likely. But surely you just finished saying that it wasn't by being taught either that you knew it. So if you neither found it out nor were taught it, how and where did you come to know it? Well, maybe I give you the wrong answer when I said I knew it by finding it out myself. Well, then how did it happen? Well, I suppose I learned it in the same way as other people. And that brings us back to the same argument. From whom? Well, do tell me. Well, from people in general. When you give the credit to people in general, you're falling back on teachers who are no good. What? Aren't they capable of teaching? No, they can't even teach you what moves to make or not make in knucklebones. And yet that's a trivial matter, well, I suppose, compared with justice. Well, what? Don't you agree? Yes. So although they can't teach trivial things, you say they can teach more serious things? I think so. At any rate, they can teach a lot of things that are more important than knucklebones. Well, like what? Well, for example, I learned how to speak Greek from them. I couldn't tell you who my teacher was, but I give the credit to the very people you say are no good at teaching. Ah, yes, my noble friend. People in general are good teachers of that, and it would be only fair to praise them for their teaching. Why? Because they have what it takes to be good teachers of the subject. What do you mean by that, Socrates? Don't you see that somebody who is going to teach anything must first know it himself? Isn't that right? Well, of course. And don't people who know something agree with each other, not disagree? Yes. If people disagree about something, would you say that they know it? Well, of course not. Then how could they be teachers of it? Well, they couldn't possibly be. Well then, do you think that people in general disagree about what wood or stone is? If you ask them, don't they give the same answers? Don't they reach for the same things when they want to get some wood or stone? And similarly, for all other such cases, I suppose this is pretty much what you mean by understanding Greek, isn't it? Well, yes. So they agree with each other in these cases, as we said, and with themselves when acting privately. But don't they also agree in public? Cities don't disagree with each other and use different words for the same thing, do they? Well, no. So it's likely that they would make good teachers of these things. Yes. So if we wanted somebody to know these things, we'd be right to send them to lessons given by these people in general. Well, certainly. So if we wanted to know not just what men or horses are like, but which of them could and couldn't run, would people in general be able to teach this as well? Well, of course not. Isn't the fact that they disagree with each other about these things enough to show you that they don't understand them and are not foursquare teachers of them? Well, yes, it is. So if we wanted to know not just what men are like, but what sick and healthy men are like, would people in general be able to teach us? Well, of course not. And if you saw them disagreeing about it, that would show you that they were bad teachers of it. Well, yes, it would. Ah, very well then. Does it seem to you that people in general actually agree among themselves or with each other about just and unjust people and actions? Not in the slightest, Socrates. Really? Do they disagree a huge amount about these things? Well, very much so. I don't suppose you've ever seen or heard people disagreeing so strongly about what is healthy and unhealthy that they fight and kill each other over it, have you? Oh, of course not, Socrates. But I knew you've seen this sort of dispute over questions of justice and injustice. Or even if you haven't seen it, at least you've heard about it from many other people. Well, especially Homer, since you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, haven't you? Well, I certainly have. Well, of course, Socrates. Aren't these poems all about disagreements over justice and injustice? Well, yes. It was over this sort of disagreement that the Achaeans and the Trojans fought battles and lost their lives, as did Odysseus and the suitors of Penelope. Well, you're right. I suppose the same is true of those Athenians and Spartans and Boeotians who died at Tanagra and later at Coronea, including your own father. The disagreement that caused those battles and those deaths was none other than a disagreement over justice and injustice, wasn't it? Well, you're right, Socrates. Are we to say that people understand something if they disagree so much about it that in their disputes with each other they resort to such extreme measures? Well, obviously not. But aren't you giving credit to teachers of this sort who, as you yourself admit, have no knowledge? I guess I am. Well then, given that your opinion wavers so much, and given that you obviously neither found it out yourself nor learned it from anyone else, how likely is it that you know about justice and injustice? From what you say anyways, it's not very likely. See, there you go again, Alcibiades. That's not well said. What do you mean? You say that I say these things. What? Aren't you saying that I don't understand justice and injustice? No, not at all. Well, am I? Yes. How? Here's how. If I asked you which is more, one or two, would you say two? I would. By how much? By one. Then which of us is saying that two is one more than one? I am? Wasn't I asking and weren't you answering? Yes. Who do you think is saying these things? Me, the questioner, or you, the answer? I am. And what if I asked you how to spell Socrates, and you told me which of us would be saying it? Well, I would. Come then, give me the general principle. When there's a question and an answer, who is the one saying things, the questioner or the answer? Well, the answer, I think, Socrates. Wasn't I the questioner in everything just now? Yes. And weren't you the answer? Well, I certainly was. Well then, which of us said what was said? Well, from what we agreed, Socrates, it seems that I did. And what was said was that Alcibiades, the handsome son of Clinias, doesn't understand justice and injustice, though he thinks he does, and that he is about to go to the assembly to advise the Athenians on what he doesn't know anything about. Wasn't that it? Apparently. Then it's just like in Euripides, Alcibiades. You heard it from yourself, not from me. I'm not the one who says these things. You are, and don't try to blame me. And furthermore, you're quite right to say so. This scheme you have in mind, teaching what you don't know and haven't bothered to learn, your scheme, my good fellow, is crazy. Okay, what just happened here? Alcibiades thought that he knew what justice is. Socrates suspected that Alcibiades had no idea what justice is. But as we came to see, the dialogue was not a conflict about what justice is, but was a conflict about whether or not Alcibiades knew what justice is. Socrates took up the role of questioner, and Alcibiades that of the answer. All throughout the dialogue, Socrates never made a single assertion about anything. All he did was ask about the beliefs that Alcibiades had. As it turned out, Alcibiades turned out to agree that based on what he believed, he could not possibly know what justice is. At no point in the dialogue did Socrates try to replace any belief about justice that Alcibiades held with a belief that Socrates held. All Socrates did was demonstrate the ignorance of Alcibiades about the subject. It was not until the end of the dialogue that Alcibiades even realized that, according to his own beliefs, he was ignorant of justice and could not hold a grudge against Socrates for this. You see, this is the difference between a dialogue and what passes as conversation in this day and age. There was no trading of speeches on the part of the interlocutors. There was no attempt to undermine the position of either interlocutor with the goal of being right. What happened was that both interlocutors simply agreed to be honest and see if they could learn something about Alcibiades. Alcibiades underwent a spiritual exercise in this dialogue. He, through the help of Socrates and logic, came to discover that he in fact held a false belief, namely, that Alcibiades' belief that he possessed knowledge of justice was false. As a dialectical exercise, the Platonic dialogue corresponds exactly to a spiritual exercise. There are two reasons for this. In the first place, discreetly but genuinely, the dialogue guides the interlocutors and the reader towards conversion. Dialogue is only possible if the interlocutor has a real desire to dialogue, and that is, if he truly wants to discover truth, desires the good from the depths of his soul, and agrees to submit to the rational demands of logic. His act of faith must correspond to that of Socrates. It is because I am convinced of its truth that I am ready, with your help, to inquire into the nature of virtue. The subject matter of the dialogue counts less than the method applied in it, and the solution of the problem has less value than the road traveled in common in order to resolve it. Learning to dialogue is a spiritual exercise of immense value, not because it helps us argue with others, but because it helps us structure our internal dialogue with ourselves. When we fail to effectively dialogue with others, there's little reason to assume that we are any more effective in dealing with our own beliefs. Much like we trade speeches in typical conversation, so too do we make elaborate speeches to convince ourselves that what we are saying is true, as opposed to inquiring into whether or not we actually believe what we say, or are justified in believing it at all. In sections 116e to 118e of the same dialogue, Socrates presents to us some startling revelations. He argues that if someone knows that he does not know of a thing, that he will defer to someone who knows. This is obvious to see about ourselves. When we know we do not know anything about medicine, we do not try to diagnose ourselves or give out medical advice, as this could kill us or the person we are advising. No, we defer to the doctor. In the same way, when we know we do not know anything about doing electrical work, so here too we defer to the electrician. So someone who knows he does not possess knowledge of something does not make mistakes about the thing he does not know, as he defers those decisions to someone who does know. But if someone does know of a thing, then he will also not likely make a mistake, as he knows what he is doing. So the people who make the most mistakes are those who believe they know, but do not actually know. Ignorance of your own ignorance can kill you, and has undoubtedly taken the life of countless people. Men who believe themselves possessing knowledge of medicine due to reading WebMD can do great harm to themselves. The same can be said for those who believe they know of electrical work or investment banking. Drunks who can't tell when they are drunk. Do-it-yourself weekend warrior doing construction, and so on. It is only through the doctrine of know thyself can you come to shield yourself from the dangers of your own ignorance. And to discover your own ignorance, you must learn how to dialogue. Thanks for listening. Go team.